Hi, everybody. This is Peggy McGuire for English 104 Technical Writing. And last time we talked about technical definitions. So this time we're going to move to technical descriptions. And technical descriptions are very closely related to technical definitions. They are, first of all, written to similar audiences. Remember, we said that you are writing primarily to those who may be unfamiliar with or not experts in a particular field that you are interested in and that you have information to share about. All right, so we're looking for novice audiences, how we write for people who don't know a lot about what we are describing. And really, with definitions, it's the same thing. We're usually writing definitions for people who are not familiar with the thing we are defining. So, while definitions are meant to tell your audience what exactly something is and what exactly it involves, technical descriptions, good, strong technical descriptions, help your audience see the thing you're describing, to visualize what does it look like, what are its parts, what does it do, how does it work, how does it happen. So you notice here we are talking about things, but again we are also talking about processes, as we said with the definitions. But now you really want to think about how to make your audience see what you're talking about. That's going to keep that in mind. That's what you want. You want your audience to see what you are describing. That's your goal. Why do we need technical descriptions? Why do we need that goal? Firstly, to create a picture with words and images. So again, you're going to be using words and you're going to be using graphic information to help people see what you're describing. And usually when you're doing that, it's because you want to help your reader to be able to use the thing you're describing, to assemble it, to operate it, to manufacture it. So you are trying to give such a good picture of something that someone else reading that description can actually do something, put it together, operate it, make it. So as I said, what we're talking about here are two different kinds, closely related, but different kinds of descriptions. We're talking about the description of a product, of a thing, to aid the reader in learning how to use that product, that thing, that device. Right? So again, there's your goal. Picture it so well that your reader can use the thing that you're picturing. Right? Or you're describing a process. And in that case, what you're trying to do is get your reader to see it so well that she or he understands the steps or stages in some sort of complex event. All right, complex, which means you're going to have to break it down clearly so your reader can see all the parts of that event. Okay, so we're talking products and we're talking processes again. Now, let's say a word about subjectivity and objectivity when you're describing something in technical terms. First off, we have to acknowledge that it is impossible for a human to write something in a purely objective way. Humans cannot be purely objective. We bring our backgrounds, our prior knowledge, and with them our biases, whether we even realize we have them or not. We have our assumptions about things. We have our beliefs about things. We bring all that to the writing process. It's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a thing that as humans, we bring our human baggage with us to a writing task. All right. So let's first acknowledge that pure objectivity is not possible in the kind of writing we're talking about here. Nevertheless, when I'm describing either a product or a process, I want to try to be as objective as possible in order to be fair and an honest broker of the thing that I'm describing. So, what can we say about objectivity in this case? We can say that to the extent possible, my writing will be based in fact, it will be impartial, I will be explicitly aware of trying to be impartial as I describe. And a good way to do that is to focus on visual details so that any observer, not just me, but anyone else who would look at the same product or look at the same process would see the same details. That's my goal. That's how I can be as impartial as possible, by thinking, what am I seeing here that anyone else would see when she or he looked at it? All right? Now, there is an exception to that rule. And that exception has to do with marketing and the whole area of trying to describe a product or a process in order to sell it to someone. All right? Selling is not an objective process. All right? There's going to be subjectivity involved. What kind of subjectivity in marketing? Well, we use our sensory experiences, we use our judgments as we describe the product or process. Those things are based in our own feelings and our own personal impressions of the product or the process. That's important in the tone and the purpose of selling things. That in fact it makes it a lot easier to sell things when we can bring to it our real feelings and personal impressions that are positive and powerful. That's going to help us sell things. So if we are marketing things, we want to build on feelings and personal impressions about that product or that process. But even then, and perhaps even more importantly then, the more verifiable evidence you have to support any claim you make, the better. All right? So just because I'm bringing my feelings and my impressions to this task does not mean I can't also bring a lot of observable, verifiable information in order to support my claims. They are not mutually exclusive. I want good verifiable evidence to go along with my impressions. All right? And from a writing perspective, a good way to make sure that that's what I'm doing is by using good, clear, precise, informative language. That I'm not using a lot of vague statements that might, come out of an emotional place but don't really help the reader to visualize what it is I'm talking about. I want to use good, clear, precise, informative language throughout the process of technical description. Right? So, what are the elements of a good, strong, and ultimately useful technical description? First of all, you'll start with your title. And your title will be clear and exact and limiting. In other words, you are telling me what you are describing, but you're also making clear what you're not describing. That's what you do in a good title. That you make very specific and exact to the thing you are describing. All right? So that's your title. Now in your body, what you're going to do is, and this is the real thinking process that goes into the writing, is you want to use enough detail to serve your purpose, why you're describing this product or this process, and to satisfy the needs of your audience. Again, big surprise, purpose, and audience are your guides. So what do I need to accomplish by doing this description, and who am I writing to? And based on the answers to those questions, I think about how much detail is enough to meet my purpose and to satisfy my audience. And I make that decision, and then I use no more or no less than what I need. And no less is just as important, but no more is also important. You don't want to over describe. You don't want to give details that aren't relevant or useful. So, based on your understanding of your purpose and your audience, you decide how much is enough. How much detail is going to get to where I need to go. All right? Along with those written details, you will be using visuals. Visuals are incredibly important in technical description, not only to meet the needs of people who just learn better by looking than by reading, but also overall you strengthen the depth of an especially complex description by having pictures to go with it. And those pictures require captions or labels. So you get the picture, but you also describe what this picture is. All right? So those captions or labels need to be always accompanying every visual you use within your text to help the reader understand what it is I'm looking at. All right? And then finally, a good, useful description is going to have a descriptive sequence to organize it overall. And let's talk about what I mean by that. What sequence have to do with technical descriptions? Well, remember you are trying to describe a product or a process well enough for your reader to be able to picture it in her or his mind. In order to do that, there are a couple of different ways that you can sequence your description. First of all, there is spatial sequencing. This is for when you are describing something that is at rest, an object, a thing, a machine that is still. It's not doing anything at the moment. It's not moving. It's not going anywhere. It is standing still. If I'm doing that, what I'm answering are questions like, what does this thing do? What does it look like? What are its parts? What materials is it made of? Right? To do the best job of giving me that information, what I do is create a logical path for the physical description of this thing. Logical meaning, am I going to describe it from what it looks like from the front all the way to the back? Am I going to describe what it looks like from the left all the way to the right? Am I describing what it looks like from the top all the way to the bottom? But whichever direction I'm working in, I'm going to have a logical set of descriptors that move from one place to another. Right? Front to back, left to right, top to bottom. Whichever one makes more sense for the thing that you are describing. So that's spatial sequencing. For something that's actually doing something, for an object that is moving or is operating in some way, what you want is a functional sequence. You want to tell me step by step how this thing works, what it's doing step by step, from beginning of the process to the end of the process. Right? How does this thing work? Usually, if you're using a functional description, it's going to be one sequence that starts at the beginning and ends at the end with the logically sequenced steps in between. All right? But sometimes we do another kind of sequencing, which is called chronological. And that is to describe something that seems most easily visualized in how it was assembled. How was it put together? So you're describing step by step, again, in a logical sequence, how something is put together, or how it works, or how it happens. All right? In that case, you may end up actually with more than one sequence. depending on how complex this thing is that you're describing. All right. So let's finally talk about what a technical product description would look like, and then we'll talk about what a technical process description would look like. So here's your outline for a technical product description. All right. Part 1, your introduction. Now notice this description is going to once again be written like a well-written essay. So it's going to have an introduction. What do we do in the introduction? After we have that really good, limiting, clear title, remember that one? In your introduction, you will give a general description of the product that you are describing. You will define it. You will discuss its purpose. What is it for? You will do an overall description with using general visuals. And then you will preview its parts, right? So remember, in the introduction, we're giving the overall. But we also hint that I'm now going to talk about the individual parts of this thing within my introduction. It's a nice little preview of events to come. All right? So that's what we've got in your introduction. Your overall definition, your overall purpose, your overall description with general visuals, and that preview of what's coming next. This stage, you may end up using more than one sequence. In fact, you probably will. If the thing you're describing has multiple parts, then you're going to need a sequence to describe each of those parts in the way that I have here. Definition, shape, dimension, material, subparts, function. Now you may, for each of the parts of the thing, you have to go through one of these sequences. So, this part 2 here, this description of function of parts, may be repeated several times within your description. So be aware of that you may need to repeat part 2 for each step in your sequence. Okay? And then, part 3, as with any good, strong essay, you have a conclusion. All right? So, what do we do in a conclusion? We summarize. Here's overall what we said this thing is. And we remember to talk about, if we've talked about several parts of the thing, we talk about how those parts are related to each other. And then what we do is talk about one complete operating cycle of the thing. So I'm thinking, for instance, in your book, one of the things they use as a model of a description is a solar collector. All right, something that collects solar energy and turns it into electricity. Well, if you go through that and you describe overall what it is, and then you describe all of its parts, then what you want to do is say, okay, now that you know how the thing is put together, here's how it operates. Here's one full cycle of how it operates. And if you can describe one full cycle, then your reader has the understanding in general of how this thing works. So you want to, in your summary information, give one complete cycle of the operation of this thing you're describing. All right? So, and that's what we mean by operating description as part of the conclusion. And, of course, you're going to be thinking about your subject matter, your purpose, and your audience, and you'll adapt as needed to fit those things. All right? So this is a good outline for you to follow, but when it comes to the particular subject matter that you're dealing with, you may need to fiddle with it a little bit. Don't worry about that, as long as you get the key information in there that helps the reader really visualize this thing you're describing. Now, I said that we would talk about both products and processes. So here we've got an outline for a good, strong technical process description. And it's going to be a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated to say how things work than to say what they are. So let's look at what you've got in your introduction to a process description. As always, you define the process. If there is something that your reader needs to know and remember in order to understand what you are about to describe, you need to put that out there explicitly in the introduction. The prior knowledge that's needed in order to understand this. So with the solar collector, think about it. What kind of prior knowledge might you need in order to understand a description of a solar collector? Where you're probably going to have some understanding of solar power, how we actually get power from the sun before we talk about this thing that will collect it and process it. So I want to think about what my reader needs to know in order to fully understand this process that I'm about to describe. So, a brief description of the process, principles of operation, how the process works overall, and are there any special conditions needed for the process to occur? So if I'm talking about how a solar collector works, I would probably have to say something like, you're going to need X number of days of unclouded sunlight in order to get enough sun power to do this. Or, you know, what conditions need to prevail in order for the process I'm talking about to occur. All right. Are there any special terms here? Remember a few weeks ago we talked about specialized language, technical language. Well, here's where you really have to be aware of, are there words, is there technical language here that the layperson is not going to be familiar with? If so, in my introduction, I define those terms. Or remember we said that if there are a very large number of such terms, we create the glossary and put it in the back, or do whatever we need to. We choose one of the ways we talked about a few weeks ago about how to make sure that you have defined all specialized technical terms so that your reader will understand what you're saying. All right. And then, as with the product description, the final piece of the introduction is the preview of what comes next, the preview of the stages of the process that I'm about to describe. All right? And here we are with the body of the essay, in which we describe the stages in the process of operation of this process. Okay? So, here's where we really break it down, and remembering that you're the expert here and you're writing to non-expert audiences, really think through what is each stage of the process that I'm about to describe. And then I take my first major stage, I define it, I discuss the purpose of it, I talk about any special conditions that are needed at this stage. If there are sub-stages, if you're really getting complicated, there may be sub-stages that have to be talked about. But that's what I'm going to do in order to talk about each stage of the process. Think about, what's my first stage? Then, what's my second stage? I repeat the sequence. Definition, purpose, special conditions, sub-stages. Third major stage, repeat again. So you can see this is a very structured, repetitive process to do this kind of description. You take one stage at a time and you describe each stage the same way. Definition, purpose, special conditions, substages. And you keep going until you have hit all of your major stages. Described the same way. And then in your conclusion, summary of the major stages. And again, just as with the product description, if this is a process description, you want to describe one complete cycle of the process. How you get what it looks like when you start at the beginning and get to the end of the process you're describing. And once again, depending on what your subject matter is, who your audience is, and what your purpose is, you may need to adapt or fiddle with some of these steps, but you want to have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion set up in a way to really help your reader visualize the process or the product that you're describing. So, that's your task for this week, to figure out how to adapt this information so that you can come up with a really good description of some product or process that you are familiar with and that you feel like you can share with people who would not be so familiar. Remembering that your goal is to write in such a clear and precise and logically sequenced way that your reader can see, can visualize what it is you're describing. So good luck with that task.